I'm Josh Arneson. I'm the town manager here in Richmond. I want to thank Jana Brown and Stephanie Smith mostly for putting this together and inviting the key players here to talk about the FEMA buyout elevation, relocation program as well. So I don't have too much to say. I'm going to sort of turn it over to Jana and Stephanie and the rest of the team here to introduce themselves and I think kind of get going.
So, great. Thanks, Josh. Hi, everyone. I'm Jana Brown. For those of you who don't know me, I represent Richmond and Montpelier. And really appreciate so much the folks from Vermont Emergency Management coming here to Richmond today in person so that we can exchange some information, have a bit of Q&A. And so thank you all so much for your work and thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting us and helping us put this together. So hi, everyone. Stephanie Smith. I'm the State Hazard Mitigation Officer at Vermont Emergency Management. So I manage our hazard mitigation program and happy to give an overview after we do intros.
Hi, all. Brian McWalters, State Hazard Mitigation Planner, working with Stephanie on all that.
I'm Kyle Midash. I'm the Regional Floodplain Manager for Chittenden County and Richmond specifically. So I kind of mostly work with Tyler Mesha or the zoning administrator on kind of permitting these things, technical assistance, kind of designs, kind of that more, nuts and bolts of what a home elevation would be or, buyout, things like that, kind of working with the town in permitting it and things like that.
So do you want to
Sure.
give an overview?
Start with an overview and mostly want to leave time for answering questions because I'm sure there are quite a few of those. I manage our hazard mitigation program, which includes planning and grants. The large grant funding that we have coming up following this July flooding will be FEMA's hazard mitigation grant program, and we can do a couple of different things with that for private properties. So we're anticipating probably 45 million total across the state in that program. With the exception of buyouts, there is a 25% match. So we can talk more about that piece too, but there's a required local match of 25%. But there's three main things which Josh alluded to at the beginning, which we can do, which is property buyouts, which is where we're purchasing a structure, demolishing it. It ends up in town ownership as open space in perpetuity. That's the very quick sentence on buyouts. There's a lot more to it than that. But again, those are 100% cost covered. So we're paying for all of the pieces of that and doing day before the storm property appraisal. So it's based on the value the day before the storm happened. Elevations, which I think is what most people in this room are interested in from our earlier conversations. So elevations are possible under that program, 75% FEMA funding. FEMA is going to pay for lifting the structure and they're not going to pay for other things. So there's a little bit of a making sure that we know exactly what FEMA is covering. We've done a few elevations since Irene, but not a ton. And they're a little more complicated. So there's a couple of things that we need in order to put in those applications. We need an elevation certificate so we know where your building sits within. And this is Kyle's area, who can speak a lot better to this than I can, which is why he's here. If there are questions on that piece. But your home would need to be elevated 1 foot above base flood elevation because that's the requirement in Richmond. And so figuring out how high that needs to be. And then having engineered designs that show that it's going to be a foot above base flood elevation at the end. So those are the pieces we would need to put the application together. So that understanding how high it needs to go, what the plan is for the structure. And there's a total which actually just went up. Do you remember? You don't remember what it is off the top of your head? I have the buyout number in my head. But I can find this quickly, I think. There we go. So the total project cost needs to be below 228,000, or we have to do what's called a benefit cost analysis. So there's a couple of things that can make that cost go higher. If something is historic, we're required to follow your historic requirements. So that might mean continuing siding down further. That can make the cost go up a decent amount if that's the case. But if the total project cost is under 228,000, and if the property is within the special flood hazard area, so there's a little bit of nuance here, then we can do it with FEMA funding at 75%. Again, very high level overview of elevations. I'm sure you guys have questions. But there's one more project that Josh alluded to that I'll talk to briefly, which is moving a home. So it's also possible under this program to lift up a house and move it to a different site that's not in a risky area. So we would need to have that site identified in order to apply. And then the application is to physically relocate the building to a different site. That would require that we do that benefit cost analysis I talked about, which is that's how we show FEMA that the project is cost effective, so that the benefits outweigh the cost of the project. So whenever we have to do one of those, it gets a lot trickier. So if we can avoid that, we want to be able to avoid it. But those are the three options in terms of projects for private properties. There's also one other piece I'll mention, and then I'll take it's open for questions, which is that there are some other things we can do, like larger river assessments. So we've done some scoping studies. Is that where you were going?
Yeah, I wanted to explain the town kind of, yeah, okay, thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah, so we can do scoping studies to look at potential alternatives. So it could be we're looking at a bridge that we know is undersized and we're going to do designs for a larger span bridge and figure out what that looks like. Or it could be we're looking at a larger area of a community and trying to figure out, are there constriction points where we could do a floodplain restoration project where we're removing fill, giving the river more space? Are there undersized structures like a bridge? We could look at a much broader area and figure out what options we have that could reduce risk more broadly. So one individual buyout reduces risk for that owner, but unless we can get a couple in a row and do a restoration project, we're not reducing risk more broadly. So that's also on the table and all of this needs to go through the town. So the town needs to be on board, willing to support the application. It's voluntary for the property owner as well. I'll stop there because I know it's a lot. There's a lot of detail. So do you want to open it up just for questions, Josh? And
Sure.
what people have?
Well, I guess before that, just so everybody's aware too, the select board, a few meetings ago made a motion to generally in support of all three of these programs. So I think each individual application should still go back before the select board so they can sign off on that. But I have a high degree of confidence they're going to approve to work with every single person that wants to work in this program. As Stephanie said, the town sort of acts as sort of a flow through for, especially, I'm most familiar with the elevation program because when I got here, we were closing one out on Jones Mill Road. So I think the way that works is like the funding comes from the state, it comes through the town, and then it gets paid out to the property owner. And then the property owner is still responsible for that 25% match. And part of that, just so you're aware, is you then have to follow all procurement guidelines from the town as well. So you can't just go, hire somebody to do it. We have to go through the bid process and make sure that we're following the procurement guidelines for the town and for the state and for FEMA. So it does get a little bit complicated to access that funding, but that's what we have to do to make sure that we're following all the right rules. I think that's sort of, and like you said, I think with the Jonesville property, there was some question over certain things, like the beams, I think were rotted maybe, and there was a question, would that be covered or not? I forget what the answer was, but like you said, it's just the elevation. So if you're doing the elevation and you're like, oh, we're going to re-side it as well, the siding wouldn't be covered. You could maybe add that on with the contractor, but that wouldn't be covered. It's just the FEMA or just the mitigation portion of it.
Yeah, and FEMA tends to put a pretty heavy line between fixing things that broke and doing mitigation. So if this is the mitigation side of it, so it needs to be structurally sound enough to be lifted. And they're not going to pay for those fixes through the elevation process.
So that's all I had for sort of extra insight, but if anybody has questions or.
Is there anything, Kyle, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's cost wise, there's a couple different ways to break it apart, right? There's the work itself, that the contractor is gonna do, and then there's gonna also be an engineer involved to draw up those design plans, and then there will also be a probably engineer surveyor at the same time to collect those elevations. So I think where a lot of people get tripped up is hey, it's going to cost this much. But then when you get into, and especially with the FEMA funding, you're really going to have all that stuff well documented. So you're going to have an engineer, you're going to have a surveyor. You're going to run into some incidentals, I think, more than just the cost to lift the house. Just to be aware of all the costs involved and how that's kind of broken up. You might be involved with a couple different people to do it.
And there's one other piece that prompted for me, which is that there's a requirement if you elevate the structure that either you have a LOMR, so a letter of map revision showing that your home is now out of the special flood hazard area, or you're required to have a deed with the town for the property that requires continual flood insurance in perpetuity. on the property. So the flood insurance should be less because the risk is significantly less. But there is that requirement as well. So you're required to maintain flood insurance in perpetuity.
Yeah, so again, that might be something that like you talk to your insurance company about ahead of time and be like, hey, I'm thinking about elevating this so high up, like, can you give me a quote? What would that be if I'm required to keep it on for the life of the property? Yeah, just like the other kind of little pieces to think about, the costs involved with it.
I have so many questions.
Let's start with one.
Is the 1 foot requirement, the metric that's used? Or can you elect to try to get higher up out of the water? Because
Yeah,
I'll say,
no,
every 10-year thing that's happening every other year is probably not
absolutely.
gonna get any better.
Yeah, so the FEMA minimum is at or above the base flood elevation. Richmond has 1 foot above. Our state model bylaws are 2 foot above. And then like 3 foot above regulations are mostly like coastal type things. For like wave surge. So 2 feet above is kind of our state standard, but like if you can and want to keep going, like you can keep doing that. Yeah, absolutely. And then like the other things would be like, if the utilities are now in the basement, like how do you get those upstairs? And like, how is that kind of reconfiguration? Cause like you're elevating the house, but if everything's still in the basement, I mean, presumably you'd be filling it in, but just kind of those other things to think about, like, is there a bathroom on the first floor that you want to move up, or like kind of the plumbing and the electric and the utilities, kind of elevating that stuff as much as practical. And there's no kind of one size fits, it's kind of the individual building, what makes the most sense to get everything up and out of the water.
And Stephanie, are those qualified expenses like filling in the basement, moving the mechanicals? And if you wanted to go higher than 1 foot, is that also covered?
It is, as long as we're watching for your own sake, the price, but also for the FEMA, for that 228,000. So if you go a lot higher, it could make the price higher. So being cautious of that. So again,
Is there any distinction in the availability of the funds between private residence, mixed use, commercial?
so it's a slightly different process on the commercial side. So commercial is eligible for buyouts and they would be eligible for flood proofing, that side of things. So yes, there are other projects we could do there.
Yeah, so I'll butt in here. The big difference with residential and non-residential is residential, you have to like go up because like people are living in there, the water can rise when you're sleeping, like it has to be that safe. Whereas a commercial building or a non-residential building, you can start to go down the road of like dry flood proofing, where you put like a membrane on the inside of it so it's 2 feet above, and then have like little slats in the doors so that it keeps it from any entry points. Or you can also, if it's like parking storage or like not necessarily business operations in there, you can wet flood proof where it's vents and then the water kind of comes in and goes out. You keep everything up high. And so those are kind of your options. With residential, you kind of only have that option of elevating. Whereas with the other properties, there are some other things you can do.
Okay, and very specifically mixed use for our sake. There are people that live in the building.
So then that would just be residential. Yeah. But
Is it mixed? It's the business downstairs and residential upstairs? Okay. Well, if the residences are above
yeah,
already, then yeah.
you can probably look at that dry flood proofing for the bottom. You probably wouldn't want to do wet flood proofing in that instance, but the dry flood proofing with that kind of foundation work, the membrane inside, the doors, that would probably be what you'd want to do there.
And that is also eligible.
I have 2 questions. One is more personal and one is kind of a group question. So when you say that FEMA only pays for elevation, I'll just use our house as an example, but I know there are other houses need to be elevated. Like our house needs to be elevated, take out the foundation, replace the foundation. Like, is it just the elevation that's covered, or is the whole like process of replacing the foundation covered?
So it is, the I caution just because we've in the past run into scenarios where we're fighting FEMA on things like insulation or a space heater for something that's a crawl space where there are flood vents. And we're saying, well, it's Vermont, it's cold. Like you can't have a space under your house that's open and not elevated or not insulated and with heat. And so FEMA is a little bit particular about some of those things. We won in that case. We got that through. Their concern from a higher level is that they show up and you've put an addition on or you've done all of these other things because you had a contractor on site. That's FEMA's concern.
Okay.
So they micromanage it a little bit to make sure that you're not doing that.
Okay.
So I just want to, so yes, we'll elevate, new foundation, seal everything up, any like fixing of your walls, because when you elevate, you might crack some walls. So any of that like final cleanup work, that should all be included.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I think the siding example is good. Okay. And then just from a group perspective, that there are a few of us here that all live on, or many of us here, all live on one street.
Mhm.
And both like the parking lot, the street, the homes are continuously getting flooded because I think the term is the flood basin, like Volunteers Green is the flood basin where water's supposed to go. I don't know if is that the right term?
Yeah, I mean, just like kind of flood storage area, basin, yeah, whatever
Yeah,
you want to call it.
That's what I think, Tyler. Anyways, it's where the water's supposed to go, but because things keep changing, the water's more frequently going past that into like our street and businesses and things like that. So I think we're curious, you know, for the homeowners on that side of the street and business owners, like what are some examples of projects? Like we looked at the projects towns have done to like, what can we do to help redirect? Is there anything we can do so the water doesn't keep, you know, coming up onto our street and over the street? And is it all of us elevating our houses? Is it redirecting the water? Like what I don't know the options. Are there options? Yeah.
Yeah, that would be, you know, like the engineering scoping study. So you would want to get an engineer to kind of look at the hydraulics of the site, look at the contours. Where's the water coming from? Where's the water going? I mean, I think the issue here is kind of, we are in a big map floodplain, like it's pretty big. And the water is able to come in from the Winooski. You know, it probably doesn't drain very well. There's like a whole number of things that could play into the situation. So I think that's like the other piece to it is like, do you look at the scoping study? But then at that point, it's like, okay, we did a scoping study. You know, you might end up going to the elevation piece anyway. So it's just how long do you want to wait? How long do you want it to go? Yeah.
What we could do, sorry, and then we'll get back to questions, is so we can do scoping under this hazard mitigation grant program round. The requirement for FEMA is that if we scope under that funding round, we have to be able to submit projects under the same funding round. So we're looking at the end of next year as the final deadline, but the town could put in a scoping application now that includes looking at a broader area, but also funding to do elevation certificates and engineering for elevations. That could all be wrapped into one scoping application. And we can help you put that together if that's of interest. So that does have a 25% match. But then at least we can help you guys get those elevation certificates and get the designs.
Yeah. And maybe that approach informs a little better of like how high to elevate and like, you know, what are the risks.
Right.
So that comprehensively, that's probably a good approach, just kind of seeing what the water is doing and then seeing how you mitigate from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll send you those application forms, Jeff.
This is just a thought, but wouldn't it make more sense to get right to the engineering program, find out where the water's, when we've heard it's coming off the hills here and running down across the interstate. It's coming up from here. It's coming up from Bressers, where that used to be all underwater long ago, and now it's all built up land. And wouldn't it make sense to get an engineer in right away and find out, rather than worrying about lifting up our houses or going to FEMA for this and that, let our houses be. And I know you need massive repair and there are other people, but if you're going to the source of why the river is overflowing, I know times have changed. We get heavier rains and we're going to continue to get heavier rains, but you have to find out, what can we do? And I know a law was passed a long time ago that you can't dredge the river. I grew up here and they dredge the river. Now and then you'd have a minor overflow, but nothing after the massive flood. Why can't we go back to dredging the river? We never had islands. If you stand on the bridge here, you can see islands all the way down of land that's built up. That was all removed and it was brought to the road department, and they used it for sanding roads mixed with salt and whatnot like that. But it seems the problem is that we've got to find a place for the rain to go and the river water to stay lower, rather than spending all this money on raising our houses. Unless you've already had damage, but it just seems like we're going around, like going through the back door first.
Yeah, no, I agree with the engineering study. I think that is the most comprehensive way to address this and kind of understand what's happening. As we move from there, like the river dredging and things is something we've kind of moved away from because of the costs. Like it's easier to kind of fix the building than it is to keep doing and funding that and finding people to do it. And it also dredging the river, ultimately kind of makes it more powerful. We're looking for roughness and kind of a rough riverbed that can slow down and spread out water rather than as you dredge it, it keeps wanting to cut down, and then the banks collapse in. So I think the way we look at that now is kind of more slowing down the water, spreading it out, having a place for it to go, having our buildings elevated or out of the way. And that's kind of the long-term solution rather than, keep trying to fight the river because ultimately you can't fight it.
But if it's your house, I don't know if you were in the floodplain, but
Yeah.
you're looking at your house, you have to go to FEMA. You have to get town approval, you have to get this approval, that approval. That's easier than looking into the course of the river. What do we do about the course of the river?
Well, long term, yeah, because the course of the river is going to die. It's dynamic. It keeps changing. Big flood comes, it brings more rock down with it. Like it's hard to fight it. As humans, it's hard to fight nature. So ultimately, we can just protect our investments. Is kind of the best way around it over the long term.
Yes, I agree there was a lady. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, there's a lot of people that, historically we did it. We straightened our rivers, we dredged them, and it got us to a lot of places where we are today, where we're seeing the big landslides and we're seeing those banks become unstable. And ultimately you can't fight it.
But the river coming up is what's pulling. When you have water going over the banks, it's pulling it back, it's bringing it back down. I mean, I was here for over 30 years and it never went. It was, I know what you're saying.
No. And I guess like 30 years is like a short time in the rivers world, like we're looking at the river over like 200, 300, like lifetimes. So like, that's why we kind of look at it like, hey, instead of fighting the river and the next generation fighting the river and just keep fighting the river and keep making it more powerful and changing things around, we just move our infrastructure away, we raise it up, and then that is safe ultimately, no matter what happens, because we can't predict the rainstorms,
Right.
Like this summer we got 9 inches in like 24 hours or a little longer than that. Like that's crazy. Like, and we can't stop that. Like there's no stopping it. It could be 10, it could be 12 inches, it could be shorter periods of time. Like it's crazy.
Do you have the authority or somebody comes to you and wants to raise their house? Do you have the authority to look at that application and say, no? Oh, you need to move your house or demolish it and move out of that area and build it somewhere else?
Yeah, so that would be the option. So that's kind of what we talked about here was like,
Yeah.
okay, so you can raise your house where it is and it's, you know, protected, or we can buy the house out and you can take your money and go up and move up on the hill somewhere where you're out of harm's way. So
Yeah.
I think there's not any one answer to anyone's situation. I mean, it plays down to like the natural piece of it, like what's the river doing? Where's your house? What is your financial situation? Like, what are your, do you want to keep your kids in the school? Like, there's so many different
Yeah.
things that could play into why someone wants to live where they live.
But I think maybe if I understood your question correctly is we get to make the choice. Someone from the state or FEMA couldn't say you have to move your house, because in a way, like I'm wondering about the determination of substantial damage. Like, is it the flood insurance who makes that, or like we just want to make sure we make the choice and not someone else? Because I'm still
No one's gonna make that choice. If you're in your house and you want to stay there, you can stay there. No one will, like, we're just presenting your options of what you can do.
But I would encourage you,
As
I
a
think the,
taxpayer, then my money is circled around to you. And I'm tired of a rebuilding in the same area. So it gets flooded again, destroyed again, and they fix it up, it gets flooded, destroyed, back and forth. Somebody needs to say, move out of there.
Yeah.
and I would encourage, so I think on the Rivers team, we have river engineers, and a lot of times the questions they're getting asked is, can we permit this riprap? Is this a thing that we can technically do? And the question should be, is this a good idea? Should we do this? And using that resource within A&R to say, what is the best long-term solution, and having them help you figure that out. Instead of just saying, this is what we want to do, let's just do it. You can do that, but I would encourage you to flip the conversation a little bit to, what should we do?
I know that dredging is off the table, and that we're obviously in a massive floodplain. But is there any sort of diversion opportunity? And I know that's more to the scoping thing, but I hope a levee or whatever isn't a stupid idea, but is there anything that we can do to just divert enough water from the concentrated population of where we are?
Yeah.
Also acknowledging that that has to go somewhere, so someone else down the way is just receiving that as well. But,
Yeah. I mean, floodplains are tough. Like, you can't control them. Like, the water goes a path of least resistance.
I remember digging holes at the beach when I was young and just watching it
Yeah.
collapse in. It is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the diversion thing, like that's kind of outside, like that's why you have to get an engineer to kind of look at all the hydraulics of how that goes. Like, I can't just come up with like a random idea.
I know, but does it fall within the FEMA funding thing?
It does, and I can give you examples of things we've done in other communities. I don't know what will make sense here necessarily. But larger floodplain restoration projects where we're taking an area, removing fill that's been added over time, giving access back to the river in a flood event. We've done infrastructure projects like in Brandon and giant overflow culvert, where instead of the water going across downtown, it's going under when it's high. So most of the time that's empty, but now it's another option for water to flow. So there are things depending on the area where that might make sense. But it's going to be that scoping assessment that helps you figure out what projects could fit here, because it's going to be incredibly place dependent.
Why do we have to wait so long to get an engineer, please?
Well, if we would have to put in an application if you guys want to do that and get FEMA funding, or if the town is able to fund it, you could go ahead, but.
That would seem like a quick solution for a lot of people, is to get that money right there. If the money is here, don't you think, instead of expecting everyone to raise their houses and everything?
But I think that's a longer term, we're talking a longer term, larger solution with like some sort of change to keep the water away. I think even if you get the engineering done now, construction for something like that would be years probably. So the elevation, I think, is actually, I mean, maybe correct me, but I think elevation of that process is probably quicker and more. Like, I don't really know what the options are for keeping water out of Esplanade. And if you do it out of Esplanade, well, what about Conklin Road or other areas,
And
right?
and it might be that there is no easy solution that's gonna reduce risk more broadly, and then elevations do make the most sense. But yeah,
You know, from this side where everyone's sitting, it sounds like the scoping and that helps make informed decisions on the rest of this.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the cost of scoping is, but is that potentially something that town can float to help us all inform ourselves of what we would want to be doing?
And can I, oh, sorry,
No, go-
before you answer that, what is the timeline? Because if I'm hearing correctly, I think the town could put in an application. And in that application, the town could say, we want to do an engineer scoping study to FEMA. We want to do an engineer scoping study. And we have 5 homeowners that are applying for elevation mitigation to be a part of this. And it's one application.
it could be.
And what is if Josh, at the next select board meeting, they approved it. And then it went to you, Stephanie, what is that timeline? Like
So,
approximately?
Yeah, in terms of getting the FEMA funding awarded,
Yeah,
it'll probably take a couple of months before we get it through FEMA review, but the intent with these scoping applications are that it gets through very quickly so that we can get on the ground and get solutions and then apply for the projects in the same round. So we submitted one a couple months ago. There was a freeze on federal funding for a little while, but we should have that this week, hopefully. So it might take a couple of months, but yes, it could include hiring an engineer to do the scoping and also having someone do designs for elevations.
I want to make sure you don't need to have the scoping so you do the elevations or the other program, right?
No.
The scoping would just sort of
So you
answer
could
a
do
question of, is there other options? Okay,
So you could do it at the same time. You could get the engineering to elevate done while you're looking to see if there are other options.
and what's the funding on the scoping? How's that split?
So it's 25%. Not
Match.
If the application gets approved, is there any support like helping organize or find people to do the work?
Yeah, we might run into that. Let's see where we get. If we can't find anyone, we can talk about it. But yeah.
Can you clarify one thing? So I wrote it down. I may not have understood it properly, but there's like a cycle that we're in where there's a finite amount of time you have to spend this money.
So, yeah, so right now it's a little tricky because right now the deadlines, FEMA gives us a year from the declaration date of the disaster to submit applications. So we have until July. But I can really easily request 2 90-day extensions, which I will do. And then we can request, there's another mechanism to request additional time based on the scale, which I also probably will do because we won't be ready to submit. So we'll have until at least the end of next year.
Building and design point of view, that's what I would be worried about. And I also, so actually starting and finish, so if folks go through all of this and I mean, that's gonna take a long time to do the engineering and the design, but then they also have to find a contractor and it sounds like you have to go through a bid process, so you have to find a few contractors. So is there any, once somebody's approved, how much time, is there another? I thought
Yes.
the project would be finished.
No, so we just have to have applications in. And right now I'm saying towards the end of next year, but again, I think we will have more time than that. And then from whenever the final application deadline is, we have 3 years to implement projects. So once we get the application in, we'll have to get FEMA approval. And then our finance staff will work with the town to have a sub-grant agreement in place. It's a process. And then we can start hiring contractors. The town can start hiring contractors.
Which the 3 years sounds like really reasonable for personal projects but when you start talking about these larger.
And we can request more time on that too.
Okay.
So if things aren't done, but they're moving. Yeah. 3 is what we get at the beginning, but we can request extensions.
You have a question hanging out there still?
yeah.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. You guys answered it
Okay.
a little while ago.
Is in order to qualify, is there a certain level of your home that needs to be currently below the flood level? In other words, we have an unfinished basement and I don't know the levels and what the flood. Another question I had is what is the base flood level that we need to compare our elevation certificates to? Because in the last round of this, we did have an application in, and at that time, at the very end, they said your level is not going to be competitive. And it could have had something to do with the competitive nature of that grant funding at the time. But it was a lot of work and, not anything to get from it at the end. And just wondering if there's something we should all be checking at the outset as far as elevations go to see if, going through the process would be worth it.
Yeah, so if you're within the FEMA's special flood hazard area and it's under that 228,000, it'll be eligible. But depending on, so if 1 foot above base flood elevation, if most of your house is already there, maybe that means you only have to move utilities up if you're already high enough. So it might just be less work that you need to do to get there. Depending.
But the basement, they would count as, they might not fill in the basement, or it would just be moving utilities up. Is that?
It's going to depend on how high.
Okay.
Yeah, if it's a fully below grade basement, like there's no in or out, you would likely be filling it in.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And then, as far as knowing, making informed decisions about 25% match, at what stage in this would you have a sense of an estimate of the cost, and how does a homeowner come about that?
Yeah, so until we have engineered designs, we're not going to have a better sense of what the cost is going to be. So it's gonna take until if we do that scoping assessment, it'll be 25% for the engineering to start, and then we'll have a better sense of what the cost is going to be from there.
Yeah, but the scoping assessment is different than individual elevation, right? So in an individual elevation, you would still need the engineer to look at that specific structure to determine the cost, the engineer's estimate of the cost to elevate.
Mhm.
And then the homeowner is responsible for 25% of the engineering and then 25% of that. So yeah, I think you have to kind of put a little money into the engineering to then understand the full amount of the project.
That's kind of what I was saying before, is it's gonna kind of be pieced out with
Right.
different contractors, their engineers. So yeah.
Is
But
there
I think also, like, as one of you starts going through it, you might start to find people that are familiar with it to get better figures. Like when we were doing the flood recovery work, we had some people from FEMA or from Florida, like our state program, but in Florida, come to help us. And they were giving figures, or like their ballpark figure was like $100 a square foot to elevate a building. I don't know how true that is, but that is kind of Florida. That's what they told me. So I think once you start to really look into this, you'll start to kind of get some more figures like that to kind of price out your projects a little better.
Is there any data or averages from the state on recent elevations that have happened in Vermont?
It's been a few years since we've done one. I don't know if you.
Yeah, I'm not aware of.
Oh, you haven't done too many lately. Okay.
Yeah,
No, there were some immediately following Irene,
yeah,
immediate, longer term, but
yeah.
But yeah,
it's been a few years.
Yeah,
I mean, it's been- and it's been
Pre-flood
kind of-
this year, there was very little home
interesting.
mitigation
Okay.
work going on.
Anything pre-2020 as far as pricing is out the window because of
Yeah.
inflation. Okay.
I know the state has 4 or 5 historic buildings along State Street in Montpelier. And I know for the sake of filing their own FEMA paperwork, they're probably going to be getting some estimates on the cost of elevation and other mitigation activities. And those would be public documents. So there could be some clear guidance in terms of what the market looks like right now. We're not quite there yet.
Yeah,
That could be helpful when you talk about the per square foot estimate, so that if someone's looking at their house and saying, yeah, I have an 1,800 square foot house, is it even worth going down this road? You could at least have.
yeah.
More
And I'm
reliable.
sure there's also like Montpelier, Barry, like there's people starting to do that work down there. I would just caution to probably try to keep residential with residential, because the state buildings aren't residential and they're probably looking at different types of mitigation.
Possibly.
So, yeah,
Or
but I would
houses.
think that, yeah, I can ask around and see what contractors have been giving out now.
Yeah.
Cause I haven't had, my region hasn't been, I mean, Richmond, you guys have been affected, but I know like Montpelier and down in the southern part of the state, they're a lot more involved right now.
I wonder if one of the first estimates that would help folks is that estimate of the engineer, and I now am remembering that, but how much that costs, so homeowners would know how much they would have to match to even get a better sense of the estimate would be good to know. And do we contact an engineer to,
No, so it'd have to go through the town and following town procurement.
is that after the application is approved? I see.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But we could, the application doesn't need to say, we're gonna do designs for these 5 houses. Like it can be, we're gonna design elevations for a set of houses. Here's a rough number. And then we can get a better sense once someone's hired of what that's gonna cost before any of you commit to it. So it could be, we run it that way. Does that make sense?
Is that a separate application than the individual elevation applications?
Yes.
I see. So the individual, yeah, that helps.
Yeah, so this is the building application, and then it's a separate application from there.
Tyler, you had a question?
Oh, yeah. Is there any additional resources, through FEMA or in our case SBA that would low interest loans, grant programs, anything to offset that 25% cost that might be a really tough burden for some of us?
I think you can use SBA. I don't know if you know more than I do on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I would think that you can use.
Let's just take that one off the table for the sake.
Yeah.
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 But
It needs to be non-federal, so it needs to be a source of non-federal funding. So the state has requested what's called CDBG-DR, the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funding, which is one of the few pots of funding that is federal but can be used as match. That requires Congress allocating it, and I don't think anyone knows how that's going to go right now. But if we do get a good amount of money from that program, it might be possible that some of that could go towards match for these other projects, but we don't, that's still a little out. We don't know yet. It's going to take some time before we know whether that's possible and how much, and then what we can use it for.
is there any state level grants, anything like that, that could help offset the group cost here? Maybe one part of this, the engineering cost or I'm sorry, the scoping costs.
Yeah, I'd have to look into that. I don't have those resources. But if you're talking for the residential neighborhood and then also for your business, so the sort of two. So I'm sure that, yeah, I can look into that and see if I can hopefully provide folks with a better sense of that.
And there is potentially, so if it's a substantial damage, and maybe you know more about this than I do, the the cost of compliance.
Yeah, if you had flood insurance and you were substantially damaged to the point where you have to mitigate, so I will just go down the substantial damage thing right now, because you probably have heard about it over the summer. Substantial damage is when the flood damaged 50% of your building pre-flood building value. Just the building, the assessed value of only the building, not the land. So if 50% or more of that building is damaged, so your cost estimates to bring it back to the pre-flood condition are over 50% of what it's worth, you have to then elevate or otherwise mitigate. So wet floodproof, dry floodproof. So then if you have flood insurance, there's called what's increased cost of compliance. So they recognize like, hey, flood damage, it's going to cost you X amount of dollars. I think the limit now is like 30-some thousand, 33, 32. So you can get that up to that amount to mitigate the building again. But that's only if you have flood insurance.
But that can go towards the match, if that's the case. It's very, sorry, I can see your face.
Wait,
It got very complicated.
yeah, I'm sorry, I'll say two things. Yeah, and just on the match funding too, I just don't, if anyone knows about any of the money that the philanthropic money or fundraise money, I think we would all be interested in that. I might need your help. So we're waiting to hear about the substantial damage. We're still waiting to hear from our insurance company. The 30,000, is that the maximum that an insurance company can give? Is that what?
Well, no, so this is just, so you will get your payout for whatever it was, but you can add on 30,000 to raise it.
Okay,
Yeah, no, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, no, your flood insurance policy is your flood insurance policy. This is what's called ICC.
okay,
So if you talk to Tyler and he's like, hey, you're substantially damaged, and you have to elevate your building, you can leverage your flood insurance for another 30,000 to get that done.
Okay, thanks. And I had one other question. I keep getting confused between if our insurance company or if Tyler decides if it's substantial damage, because our assessment is on our property and the building. It sounds like insurance can take just the building. So is it insurance or Tyler who decides if it's substantial damage?
That would be Tyler in conjunction with myself or, you know, because and that's based on information you provide, right? So like, if you have a recent appraisal, you can use that value. And then you would need your construction cost estimate. And that would be your own. So like, you can work with Tyler to come up with the substantial damage based on the information you have. The more information he has, the more accurate we can make a determination.
Okay.
So I'm just a little confused because when I talked to Tyler, he talked about making a substantial improvement determination and the process we go through is that, but he doesn't do anything about.
So same thing, substantial improvement is just sunny day substantial damage. So you have a house in the floodplain, you want to put an addition on, you want to put new windows, new kitchen. If that cost gets up to 50% of the building value, you have to mitigate because FEMA in an insurance world is like, hey, now you have substantially increased the value of this house. It's going to cost more to insure. It should be flood mitigated.
And on the philanthropic side, I know Vermont Disaster Recovery Fund is one funder of last resort and could be potential. And then Vermont Community Foundation has a new program, I think in partnership with Vermont Disaster Recovery Fund. So there's other philanthropic potential options out there too.
I was just gonna add, like, so I don't know, it took us several months, but we do have engineering. So for anyone who's wants to compare notes, and I'm also thinking, Josh, about if the town applies for this, who's gonna help coordinate and manage it all, knowing our town resources. Josh is like me, but it's gonna be hard because it's gonna be a lot. I don't have a solution for that, but so we have engineering appraisals, that's just of our home's damage, which is different than most of everyone else's. And then we did finally, after months, get a quote for lifting and a foundation fill. It's a very Vermont style quote, but because it was really hard to get. But that, I guess we would still need a new engineering quote if we go through this program, but it can help with estimates of cost for some folks, but I think ours is much higher than other people's. I think. I'm just offering if anyone wants to talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think just generally with that, like when you have more of a square house, it's kind of easier to lift. When you have things with little wings and different pieces to it, it gets a little more complicated.
Okay.
So I think like I said earlier, kind of each situation's different. I think that you guys are all trying to go through it. That's really going to start like, hey, what happened with you? What was the contractor? Kind of being together in all this is really going to help you all get through it and what's the best, and kind of I encourage that collaboration. Yeah.
Does Richmond have a long-term recovery group? Is that in process?
We don't yet. I think there's something in process. I haven't been that's the sort of separate group, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so disaster case management is in the works. I don't think that's final yet, and it's a little out of my lane, but that will work through the long-term recovery group and help provide resources and support, but it's not set up yet.
I think they're setting up through Capstone.
Yes, there will be staff positions hired in the Capstone agencies across the state. Yeah.
And would they be able to help like Josh with the management of this process, or they would help individuals?
They would help you guys.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll take anything.
Yeah, I actually just heard it on VPR on the way up here that there's 10 case managers coming. So I think that will be really helpful to kind of help navigate the process.
I wanted to introduce myself. I'm sorry I came late, but my name is Jessica Nordhaus, and I direct community outreach for Congresswoman Becca Ballant in the Vermont office. And we have been, as with the senators' offices have as well, we've been working in conjunction with them to help support all of you in your engagement with federal agencies, including FEMA. And I think we're incredibly lucky to have such good state partners. And we are also, I acknowledge and are incredibly frustrated with how slow FEMA can move sometimes. And so I would welcome any of you to reach out to our offices, or if you already have a conversation going with one of the senator's caseworkers, by all means, keep them in the loop in this. And if there's ever a way that we can help push on FEMA a little bit at the federal level, we would be happy to do that. That goes for town, state, or individuals. So I'll leave some of my business cards and feel free to reach out to our office if we can be of assistance.
So I know I've got to wrap up here, and it sounds like maybe we're reaching sort of a spot where people have got their questions. I guess maybe are there any last questions, or did you want to, is it worth to take a walk or a tour at all? This I don't know, that was part of the
Happy to, yeah.
thought.
Yeah.
Maybe we transition to that. If I don't know how many of you all can go for a tour down Esplanade, but
I think Kyle will be the most useful on
Okay.
that, but I can.
Yeah.
I can do.
and orientation wise, it's you can walk there from here. Maybe you can do that. I don't know how familiar you are with our area, but okay. Well, then maybe I'll turn it over and you guys can take that walk. We'll stop the Zoom right now. And thank you all for being here and answering the questions. Really appreciate it. Really informative.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for all the community questions as well.